podcast, where we share stories and strategies from the game's most fascinating minds. No matter where you are in your poker journey, there's always something new to learn. So let's get right into this week's episode.
Welcome back to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. I'm Zach Shaw, here as always with James Splitsuit Sweeney. How are you doing this morning, sir?
Not too bad. How are you?
Doing great. Ready to get into some strategy advice for our listeners. But the topic came up, adjusting to fishy tables, because there's a lot of that going on right now online in this new quarantine world. We've got lots of new players online, record-setting tournament sizes. And I've noticed this myself. It's not quite like pre-Black Friday or, the early days of poker, let's say, online. But we're definitely seeing it a lot more. So you wrote a great article a little while ago, 3 ways to adjust to fishy tables. Thought we'd go over those tips today.
Yeah, that works for me. I mean, this has been really, really nice seeing all of the growth in online. I just saw an article this morning that it looks like the kind of player base online has doubled over the last few weeks, but it's starting to plateau at this point. And until we have legalization and regulation through the US, I think we're going to continue seeing that. So let's push for getting that legalized and regulated in the US. That way we can see that number, do some serious multipliers. But yeah, for online, I've gotten a lot of comments from people that are just like, hey, the games seem much softer than normal. What's going on? And I figured this would be a great topic, since if so many people are flooding to online and they're not really that competent in that arena, there's some real fishy tables out there.
For sure. And, this will also apply to live when it comes back. I see these kinds of tables all the time at 1-2. And I'm always coming back actually to this article or these types of articles to continue to develop my strategies there. And one of the things that you mentioned in the article, which we'll link to in the show notes, redchippoker.com/podcast, is this idea of changing your raise sizing. Could you get into a little bit about, making your opponents feel the pain when they're on the fishier side?
Yeah, so I think what happens let's just backtrack a little bit before we get into the real micro of this, is there are tables where you have a lot of average or normal people, and then there are tables that are super, super soft. And they could be soft because there's a single massive drooler at the table, or it could be because there's multiple bad players at the table. And kind of the way that you adjust to those games can be slightly different. The more and more fish there are, obviously, the more and more you need to adjust, because you're in a totally great game, but a very different game than maybe a more normal grinder kind of game. So the thing you have to remember is a lot of players will get frustrated when there are fish at the table, because, all of a sudden what used to work doesn't quite work at this table, or at least it doesn't work the same way. Or maybe you have to think a bit more creatively. You can't just continue doing the same thing you do against the regs day in and day out. So a lot of people are uncomfortable with that, but you really have to develop comfort being in this scenario very, very quickly. Because, again, you might not get this game very often, but when you do, it's incredibly, incredibly lucrative. And one of the major ways that you can start thinking more creatively is, like you said, through the bet sizing, and thinking about what will larger bet sizes accomplish. Because far too many people get frustrated because they use the same sizes that they normally do, and they're playing pretty much the same ranges that they normally do, but the fish is just throwing a massive wrench into that system. So one of the things you have to think about is what is your goal with this fish? And some of that could be, okay, well, if I choose a larger size, are they going to continue at the same frequency that they normally do, right? There are a lot of fish, or just general players overall, that have this elasticity thing, and they're very, very elastic. And once you hit a certain bet size or raise size, all of a sudden they just start melting away at a super high frequency. But when you use normal sizes that they're used to and comfortable facing, now all of a sudden they're probably not folding that much. But if you go maybe twice as large, now all of a sudden you might find there's actually a lot more folds than you thought. I think a lot of people kind of lump all fish into making the exact same mistakes the exact same way, and they continue doing the same thing as against them, but not every single fish is the same, right? A lot of regs are the same, but not all fish are the same. There are some very, very different kinds of fish out there. You just have to be very, very aware of that and adjust your strategy and your sizes accordingly.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think a lot of people, when they think fish, they think someone who sits down and really just doesn't know what's going on, is maybe new to the game. And that type of player is one thing, but then the sort of, let's say, weaker players at the table who have a bit of a head on their shoulders will notice if you are, increasing your raise size and possibly even make minor adjustments. Those seem to be the trickier players. And the thing I always see, and what you mentioned in your article, is this tendency pre-flop to just kind of call any raise. And we've all been there at a 1-2 table. We raise an early position with a really good hand and get called in like 4 or 5 spots, and who knows what these people have. So how do the ranges factor in? Because they're playing pretty much junk ranges at this point when they're calling, right?
Yeah, pretty much. So part of that, though, is going back to the size. So if you raise your normal size, and they're going to continue with their normal range, and yeah, that's probably full of a bunch of really junky starting hands for whatever reason and rationale they give. But as soon as you go maybe a little bit larger, just outside of their comfort zone, they might actually start folding a lot of those really junky cards and only getting involved with, dare I say, a more normal range. So that's why we got to be really, really careful not to like automatically lump in and say, oh, well, they're always going to continue with, all these junk hands when I go to a large size. But honestly, most players have never tried using the larger size. They've really just used the normal raise sizes that they use, and be that isolation or open raising or whatever it is. And then they kind of tell themselves this story that, oh, well, they're going to continue anyway. Well, you don't know that, and actually there could be quite a few opportunities for you to even bluff 3-bet against a fishy opponent, because there is a size where they just say, you know what, I'm not going to continue anymore. I don't really want to put $50 in there or $100 in there or whatever it is, and all of a sudden you can start getting a tremendous amount of fold. So again, you got to be really careful and pay attention to the sizes that other players are using, see if anyone else is using large sizing and how that fishy person is reacting to that. And of course, if there are multiple fish in this game, then there's even more variables to contend with there. So the more and more fish there are, the more and more you're going to revert to like kind of just your bare bones basic ABC kind of strategy. But especially when there's only one fish there and the other players at the table aren't really capitalizing on them and making the strong strategic adjustments they need to, you have a lot of opportunity to do some creative stuff and start finding where those pressure points are within that fish strategy. Most players are not purely inelastic, and because of that, you can definitely find these points as long as you're willing to do some experimentation, and of course with that is a little bit of extra loss or at least risk, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. A little bit here for a lot gain later can be very, very good.
So we're talking about, amping up our raise size and getting more folds, but is there ever a time when we want these fishy players to kind of stay in with their less than stellar range and exploit that?
For sure. So this is one where you kind of have to be cognizant of the other players as well. So this is a lot easier when there's fish on your right? They act before you most of the time, and as such, you kind of get to see, okay, did they limp? Did they raise? If they raise, do I want a 3-bet? And if so, to what size? It's a little more challenging when they're on your left, though, right? They haven't acted yet, and you're having to make a decision before they do. So this is where you have to be cognizant of the other people, because let's say you're deciding to open raise with a strong hand, let's just say aces, whatever, and you have a fish behind you. The first question you have to ask yourself is, of course, how much value could I get out of this person? And then if I go, say, a big size or a small size, and that fish does continue, what do the people behind that fish do, right? If there are regs, or even just like, just boring people behind, you have to be cognizant of what does my size indicate about my range? What does that encourage them to do, whether or not that fish continues? And then start going from there. Again, you can always revert back to more of a ABC basic strategy, including your sizing and your ranges. But if you're looking for optimizers along the way, this is one where you could definitely look for larger sizes with your bigger hands, because the fishy players just simply aren't going to react well. But that being said, you still have to be cognizant of who else is at the table. How are they going to react? What mistakes might they make versus a big or a large or a smaller size? And then make some decisions from there. So don't get too locked into, I'm automatically going to go big with my big hands. That's very, very easy when you're like 3-betting against a fish. When you're in the big blind, sure, you could probably go large because they're probably going to continue a lot, and you can probably generate a tremendous amount of extra value. Just again, be careful, because there can be those bet sizing or raise sizing inflection points where you go too large and they start folding too much, and that's maybe not what you want to do. So you tuck just underneath whatever that pressure point is, get them to continue for the maximum amount, and then of course just start hammering post-flop.
Gotcha. And, another thing that comes to mind is our post-flop plan has to, like you said, has to be like really solid, because if we are raising to larger amounts, pre-flop all of a sudden our SPR is lower, and even the fishiest player might notice that while we raise big pre-flop, we potentially are playing weaker post-flop. So we really have to be thinking about barreling on certain flops, turns, and rivers, right?
Yeah, so as you're using larger sizing, whether it's against fish or against regs, it doesn't matter. Like, you're just inherently going to have smaller and smaller SPRs, especially if you're not playing in super deep games, which means your flop game has to be very, very solid. You have to know when to be able to fire a bluff c-bet, and you have to understand when you should probably just check and quit. And it's totally okay to check and quit against these players, as long as you're not doing that like every single time with your air, just simply because most hands are going to miss a tremendous amount of time. Even ace king whiffs the flop about 2/3 of the time. So be very, very careful with that. But just because someone is fishy pre-flop and plays a tremendous amount of hands, and obviously has frequencies that are way out of whack and way too many weak hands included, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to make those exact same mistakes post-flop. Oftentimes they do, right? Fishy players will continue too often both pre-flop and post-flop, but there are some players that feel they have to see every single flop, but then don't really continue unless they have at least a pair or draw, that kind of thing. And you can find those kind of players that are folding way more than half the time. So when that's the case, again, you might be able to actually add more hands in your pre-flop range simply because they're going to be making too many folding mistakes on the flop, and that can be very, very profitable. So this is why I don't like to give the overall advice of like just tighten up when they're fish in the game. Because maybe it's easier, sure, but there's a lot of money left on the table if that's the only thing you're going to do when there are weaker players in the game. Be it one, be it multiple, it doesn't matter. I'm really focused on how can we optimize and how can we look for more and more edge against these kind of players.
Right. And I would imagine one way to get more involved would be not just to raise, but to limp. And indeed, that's the second item on your list here. And we advise many players, especially those who are, just starting out studying poker seriously. One of the best adjustments you can make to your game early on to plug a leak is just stop limping. I know that I did that a long, long time ago, and it completely transformed my game. But over time, you see opportunities to limp, and is having fish at your table one of those opportunities?
So there are lots of opportunities to limp, and the major reason why you see advice like stop limping or especially stop open limping is because for most players it's just a massive, massive leak. They do it with far too many hands. It's super cheap, so it doesn't really feel like a big issue even when it kind of is, and it's just an easy band-aid you can throw in your strategy immediately and start getting out of some bad spots and start putting yourself into better spots more often than not. So that's kind of where it comes from. But the thing you have to be very, very aware of is that there are plenty of good spots to limp as long as you know what you're doing with that limp, what that limp is accomplishing. Now, again, when there are fish on your right and they've already acted before you, and if you're limping, then they've already limped in front of you, open limped or limped behind, then these can be situations where you might say, okay, what are my options with my hand? I could raise, I could fold, I could limp behind. And the first thing I always ask myself is, could I raise? Because if I can raise profitably, then I know I'm never folding. And the question is just, do I raise or do I limp back? And if I can't raise, then I know it's just between limping behind and folding. So it kind of simplifies 3 options down to 2. And when I'm asking myself, can I raise, I also have to ask myself, if I call, what does that really accomplish? Because if I call, say, limp behind from middle position, there are still a lot of players left to act, especially players that could take position on us. And then I have to ask, am I inviting an isolation raise? Now, good players probably aren't going to hammer with that isolation raise too often, simply because it gets very expensive, it gets very difficult against multiple limpers to get them to fold. Once that fish calls, you're probably coming along as well, which means they're probably getting involved in a multi-way pot a ton of the time. Again, they don't get that creative with their sizing, so they're probably going to go too small and doesn't really accomplish what they're trying to accomplish. It's a little too deep, but you kind of get the idea.
Yeah.
So the regs aren't overly incentivized to go bonkers here. Bad players or not so much thinking players, that could go either way, but on average, those players are a little too passive anyway, so you're probably not getting ISO'd very often. But you want to be careful about just always limping behind here. A lot of players will make the mistake of limping back with ace-queen offsuit or ace-jack suited or king-queen offsuit. Hands that just raise better, especially if there's any chance of isolating that fishy opponent when you have position. So that's kind of the way that I think about it. There are lots of hands to limp back with, though, like suited aces that could, hammer really, really big pots where you have nut flushes and they get stuck with second, third, or fourth, or fifth, sixth, seventh flushes, that kind of thing. But again, when it's the stronger kind of ace-x, like ace-jack suited, probably raising that every single time. But something like ace-deuce, ace-3, ace-6 suited could make a much better limp behind. And then your other candidates are the obvious ones, suited connectors, set mining kind of hands, Broadway hands that are playable with position against the fish, but not necessarily something that I am super happy about raising. but there's not going to be too many of those. And then maybe some suited gappers and stuff as we start getting closer and closer to the button. Just be very careful here, because a lot of players will make the mistake of just, there's a fish that limped in front of me, so I'm going to limp behind with king deuce suited and queen eight suited and everything that's even like slightly suited, slightly connected. When there's massive, massive stack depth, maybe when there's some way that you can generate a huge edge against this person, maybe, and the more and more those implied odds go up, the more and more I consider even limping behind like kind of silly stuff. But be very careful. I mean, if you're limping back with every ace-5 offsuit and every 10-9 offsuit, chances are you're going to get hammered for it, especially if you're doing that from like earlier and earlier, from the button. Okay, as long as stack depth isn't terrible, but just be very, very careful. Too many people go wild here because, again, it's cheap. It doesn't cost that much. It's just a big blind to limp back. But all of a sudden, you can find yourself in post-flop hell, and all of a sudden, you're losing some monster pots where you get super coolered against this fish, and you grumble in your head about, I run so bad, blah, blah, blah. But no, you made a pretty bad mistake pre-flop. You put yourself in this cooler spot. So be careful. Don't get nuts here. Use your brain. Use position when you can, just don't go completely crazy.
And is one of the factors here that we expect fish to play pretty transparently, and that allows us to kind of have more moves, so to speak. If they are aggressive, post-flop or even pre-flop, that's usually a pretty big signal of strength, right? These fish are typically more passive.
Typically, yeah. There are definitely aggressive fish, but the good thing is that those people are like extremely easy to identify, right? They play tons of hands pre-flop, they play them stupidly aggressively, and chances are they follow up that aggression with c-bets and barrels and stuff like that post-flop. They're extremely easy to identify. And just passive fish are easy to identify as well, right? Play too many hands, typically play them far too passively, very little aggression pre-flop or post-flop. Very easy to identify. Anyone who has like a really high VPIP is incredibly easy to ID. The thing with the limping, though, that I think is important is, obviously, if you're talking about like an aggressive fish, that's more of a concern when they're behind you. And that goes into that being aware of the isolation and stuff like that. But the other thing to keep in mind is we're talking about limping behind here. If there are fish on our left, meaning we're either first to act or there's a limper in front of us and we're deciding what we want to do, there are spots to open limp instead of just making the traditional open raise. So these could be with hands like, sometimes like sevens and hands like that. Hands that are definitely playable, are kind of on the stronger side, but are kind of more on the cusp of, do I want to open this and create a 5-way pot that's raised, shrink up that SPR, find myself in multi-way hell out of position? Maybe not. So again, you still have to be very, very cognizant of, are there isolators behind you? Are there squeezers behind you? Because again, that could be a disincentivizer to opening in the first place. You open, fish calls, get squeezed. That's not a great thing for you. So just be very, very careful with that. Again, like there aren't too many hands that are going to fit the bill. It's going to be like not implied odd kind of hands. So set mines that could hit and get paid off really big. Some like suited ace X hands, because again, you have that nut flush draw with implied odd potential. Just if you find yourself doing this too much, again, it's very easy to identify. If you're limping every single king 10 offsuit, chances are you're not necessarily doing this correct. So don't go nuts with it. Just use your head, use reason, you'll be fine.
Right. One thing I'm picking up here is that it's easy enough to identify a fishy player at the table, but the nuance here, the challenge is to factor that in with all the other player types. We're not just worried about the fish. We're very much worried about the people left to act. And I would imagine that brings us to our third item on the list here, which is where you're sitting, your exact position at the table. And you advocate for something. The first time I read this article, I realized that I had never asked for the seat change button and that I should just try and do it just for the heck of it. And ever since then, I've gotten pretty used to, trying to move to the right spot next to the fish.
Okay, so this is one that kind of, I read the article before we recorded this too, just to kind of refresh myself of what we had talked about before. And this is what helped me identify that this was definitely something that I wrote a long while ago, because my current advice would never, ever be to ask for the seat change button. And I'll explain why in a sec. But essentially, the way that articles like this came about, or at least some of like these earlier ones, is that when we first started Redship, I wanted to make sure that we had some good written content. So what we did with the co-founders is we all wrote monthly articles for a little while. And I kind of used that opportunity to kind of flesh out starter ideas for videos that I was going to do for Pro. So this kind of informed my multi-way pots video that came out very early on in Pro, and you see that in a bunch of my earlier articles. But the reason why I highlight that is because this was earlier James advice. Later James advice, dare I say in my more mature and wise state, is don't ask for the seat change button. And the reason is because I want you to get more comfortable in tougher spots. It's incredibly easy to ask for the seat change button, get the best seat in the house when it becomes available, and maybe, triple or quadruple your edge in that particular session, or at least for as long as that fishy opponent is there, or at least as long as the table dynamic stays similar to what it is. The reason why I don't suggest that, though, is because I think it does you far more to be able to dig yourself out of any spot you find yourself in. It's really easy to make a win rate when everything is perfect, including your seat and position on the game. But if you want to become the best poker player you can be, if you want to eventually move up, if you want to be able to handle yourself in, private games that are really, really good but are invite only, you can't be sitting there jockeying for a position. So it's easy when it's available, but I don't think it's the best way to spend your time. I think learning how to deal with a really crappy, fishy left that puts you in some tough spots, or even tougher where there's a couple fish and also some aggro players left after you, it does you a lot of good to be able to figure out how to do that and handle that situation better, rather than just doing the jockeying thing. And also, let's be honest, when you jockey, every reg knows exactly what you're doing. And what are you incentivizing? You're incentivizing them to start doing the exact same thing. And is that really going to be best for the poker economy overall if the regs, the day in, day out grinders, are always asking for the seat change button as soon as they sit, so that way they can get the God mode seat wherever they play? I don't want to create that. It's not to say the players don't do it already, but I don't want to incentivize more of that crap happening.
Yeah, fair enough. And I kind of saw that coming, because that's the lesson that you have taught me as well, is, when you're in a tough spot at the table, don't run, just stay there and try and figure out how to handle it. And I guess as a recreational player, and obviously we want to get recreational players into red chip poker to core, to study. I mean, we built it for people who didn't have a lot of time or a huge budget to study, and plug redchippoker.com/edge. You can go there to get core. But yeah, it's a great advice, and it's hard for us recreational players to resist taking that God seat. We don't play that often. We want that super edge. We want to tell the great story of how we, tripled up at the casino. But the truth is that you're absolutely right. I've become a much better player. When sitting, let's say, to the left of a very tough player, I'll sit there and I'll deal with it and I'll adjust and I'll learn way more than I did getting the God mode seat.
Yeah, and I mean, let's just say you're playing online, right? What are you going to play? A couple hundred of extra hands in that spot? Or you're playing live, you're going to play maybe 100 hands more in that spot? I don't know. You're not giving up that much in terms of raw dollars by not jockeying for position. Stay where you are, learn to fight it out. You become a much better player over time. If nothing else, you'll learn something, like you said, especially when you're, have garbage position against a really strong reg. But even when there's fishy spots or dynamic shifts, or all of a sudden the seat opens up and it's sat by an aggro fish and all of a sudden the entire game changes, learning how to handle that is going to be far, far better. You're not going to handle it perfectly, but even if you jockeyed for position, are you going to play that spot totally perfectly? Are you really going to quadruple your win rate? Or maybe you're just doubling it. And again, you're doubling it for maybe 50 hands, maybe 100. I don't know. I don't think it's doing for you what you think it is. I think you're just wasting a lot of time and creating a worse long-term dynamic for poker as a whole.
And it's just not always going to be an option. It's, you could be playing a tournament and, it's a completely moot point. So
it's a great point. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, those are 3 very useful tips for playing against those fishy tables we're seeing now online. And anything to add at the end here?
Just be proactive in your thought process and don't get stuck in my normal range or my normal size isn't working, and just kind of like throw your hands up in the air and get really frustrated. I know that it's easy to get a little frustrated when what you normally do stops working, be it for a session or for a long period of time, but just think about what's going on. Think about what kind of mistakes that fish is making. Sure, they're probably playing too many hands pre-flop, but that doesn't mean they're playing post-flop perfectly. It doesn't mean they're going to play all of those same exact hands if you use larger sizing. Just think creatively and think proactively, especially if there are other competent players at the table that are also thinking about you and your range and what your sizing and stuff represents, or if they're more likely to isolate you or squeeze, whatever it is. Just be proactive. And the more and more you get used to thinking proactively, first and foremost, the more questions you're going to develop that you can easily go find answers to, be it in core or asking on the forum, whatever it is, or the more kind of negative spots you're going to get rid of and positive spots you can start adding into your game, be it at the detail level like sizing or just from an overall approach.
Awesome. Well, I wish everyone the best of luck fishing out there. I know I'm going to be doing some fishing later today. Although in the online home game we have now, we're attracting all these better players. So I'm going to use your other piece of advice of holding tight. And yeah, thanks for sharing your wisdom with us as always.
Of course.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. But don't stop learning now. Head over to redchippoker.com. You'll find everything you need to get better today. Join our free, friendly strategy group and start talking poker with our coaches and community. And listen, if you're ready to take poker more seriously, sign up for Core, our $5 a week complete training platform built for players who have limited time to study. Core is packed with over 100 bite-sized lessons from the fundamentals to advanced strategies, quizzes, achievements, discussion threads, and more. And for the bravest of heart, we invite you to check out our pro membership, which includes 24/7 access to hundreds of videos, all of our playlists, all of our crash courses, and more. If you want to see what the top 1% of players are studying to keep their edges razor sharp, visit redchippoker.com/Ruby. That's RUBY, and get a special deal on your first 3 weeks. Until next time, run good, play better, and get there.